Hi, I'm Terrell Turner, one of the hosts of the CFO Game Plan. Now, today we're going to be talking about a topic, and I kind of hesitated to talk about this topic because this topic can be a little dicey to talk about it, and is economics, inflation, recession. We're going to talk about that and how it may impact your business and things you should think about. Now, I'll tell you, some of the things that we say might be new to you. Some of them might not sound all that great, but the goal here is to address, hey, what does the reality of the situation and what are some things that you could possibly do to prepare yourself and your business. So stay tuned. So, welcome to the show, and let me bring on the other host of this show, Lola Turner. Welcome back to the CFO Game Plan Show.
Oh, what's up? What's up? What's up? Hello. Another
Absolutely.
episode.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that, I talked about, because I kind of went through this, back and forth in my head because I was like, I don't know if I really want to do this because it is so easy to have a conversation about economics and inflation, recession to go way political. And so I'm just like, should we do this or not?
We should, because what better thing than to start stuff or and instigate stuff? What? No, but on a more serious note, I think the importance of the conversation definitely precedes any sort of like political correctness and all of that. And really, for me, I'm like, we're just here to share the facts, right? So you should be able to receive clear, concise information. As your CFO game plan host, we should be able to give you that information, and then you take that information and you make the decisions that you need to make in the best interest of your business. So that's what we're here for, just hard facts. And I'm super excited to jump into this conversation because I think sometimes I was an economy major in college, and so I think sometimes it's easy for you to just get really into like the technical piece of it, but it's always interesting just to see how the economics part of things really plays out in real life. So economics and accounting was what I studied, and it's always interesting just to see how all of that really applies when you actually start talking about running and building a business. So I'm excited for this conversation.
And I'm awesome that I think it is awesome, and I'm excited that of what you said about just being able to give hard facts. Because if that's your perspective, great. I'm going to be honest with you. For everyone that's watching and listening, I'm not going to give you hard facts, because I just and I
Yo,
say
first
that
of all,
not because like my goal is to sway you to a political side or not, but I say it from the standpoint of when you talk through the facts, you do get to a point where you have to make some business decisions. And
Mhm.
once you have to make business decisions off of the data that you hear, or the data that you read, or the data that you see, it's not always a black and white, like, well, here are the facts, let's do this. It's just, it does get a little bit into strategy. So there will be some opinion shared, but for the
That's
most
fair.
part, like I said, we're going to start with laying out, hey, here are the pieces of the puzzle. And then after you talk through the pieces of the puzzle, okay, all right, now as a business leader, what do we do with the information we just heard? How does that change the way we approach and the way we move forward in our business? And, that's exactly what a CFO should be doing. I mean, I think if you're in a business and you're trying to figure out, do we hire a CFO, or what should I be getting from my CFO? It's, they should be able to look at the data and then translate that into, hey, this is what the data means. Now, let's have a discussion about what does this mean for our business.
Yeah, and I'm on the same page with you. When I talked about like hard facts, I guess I was just saying more so from the standpoint of like what are the numbers and what are the numbers telling us and then what do we need to do differently. So by saying like, I don't want to get into I guess, the opinions. It was more so from a standpoint of, the political opinions, who's right, who's wrong. Like, we don't have time to do that. As a business owner, your time is limited. So you're here on this podcast to hear that information. And my favorite quote ever is men lie, women lie, numbers never lie. So this is, so anyways, I'm excited. So what we starting off with, Mr. Turner, let's jump into it.
All right. So I think, before you jump into any level of discussion about, economics, inflation, or whatever, I think you first got to lay the groundwork. And let's just talk about, what is inflation? Because inflation is a
Hmm.
topic that a lot of people have been hearing, like the word inflation has been thrown around, the word recession has been thrown around. I
Yep.
mean, people have been hearing economics for a while, but it's just like, what do those words mean? So let's start with inflation. What's your perspective on how do you explain inflation in simple terms?
So, originally, my explanation was going to be a general increase in price and a fall in the purchase value of money. And when I brought this to you, you were like, "That's yeah, is that your simplified definition?" So I guess that didn't work. So it's since been refined, and my simple definition of inflation is when prices grow faster than your income. I mean, that's is simply put, right? So the prices increase, and the rate at which your prices increase does not match the rate at which your income increases. Simplified.
And I will say is, if you look that up in a dictionary, that won't be the definition that you read. And if you look in any economics book, that won't be the definition that you read or the definition that you come across if you ask an expert. That's not the one that they're going to tell you. Now, here's
Hmm.
where I get to my opinion. It doesn't matter, because what really does matter is, how does that topic impact you? And
Right.
because there are a lot of businesses that may be experiencing a inflationary type period
Hmm.
when, hey, the market might not be going through inflation, but if you're in a business, and let's think about it, let's say you're in a business, you're trying to run your business, and the prices of everything that you need to buy to run your business are going up, but you don't have the ability to increase your prices to your customers. You
Right.
are, on an individual level, you're experiencing inflation. Although
Hmm.
everybody else in the market may not be, you're experiencing inflation. And I think what you do when you experience inflation, whether that's on an individual level or whether that's on the greater economic level, you do have to look at that and say, okay, all right, how do we make some changes to navigate this? Because if we do nothing, then you're either going to make less money, or hopefully you don't. But a lot of people end up going out of business because they
Hmm.
just didn't react fast enough.
Right. And I think the definition that you have is such a good one because it's almost the end result, right? So a lot of times when you tell people like the purchasing value of money, like, okay, what does that mean? But ultimately it just means that your money is not worth as much as it used to be, right? So I mean, the gas prices are a good example, and we're going to get to that. I'm super excited to talk about that. But the amount of money that you were spending before, it's costing you more money for the same product. So I think definitely simplified. That's really a good way to look at it.
Yeah, and I guess, so repeat that simple definition for the people that may have just joined us. I mean, can you repeat that definition again for them, for those that just joined?
Yes. So inflation is when your prices grow faster than your income, right? So the prices are going up. I think gas prices were a perfect example. Like nobody had a 15, 20, 30, 40% increase in income to combat the prices, the gas prices. So when you have situations where prices go up, whether it's as a result of your supply and demand, which we'll talk about, when you have that, your prices go up, but your income doesn't correspond, and you don't see a corresponding increase in your income. So,
Gotcha. Okay, so the simple definition is, hey, the price of what you have to buy is growing faster than your income.
There
If
you
you're
go.
thinking about, inflation in that perspective, I think it'll help encapsulate things, because there are a lot of different angles that people, ask. Okay, well, I guess you say the technical economic or economists look at things and say, well, this is happening, that's happening. But I think that as a business owner, and even on an individual level, you have to ask yourself is, are the things that I'm buying, at the price of those, growing faster than my income? Because there may be some things that you can take a step back and look at and say, okay, all right, if prices are growing faster than my income, can I do something about either buying alternative products so I can keep the cost down, or can I look at raising my income? So we'll dive into more of that. But I do think before we jump too deep into, like I said, talking about some of the examples and stuff like that, another thing that we have to discuss is, when you talk about recessions and you talk about inflations, you also got to talk about supply and demand. I mean,
That is true.
that one has to be a part of the conversation. So when it comes down to supply and demand, why do you think supply and demand should be part of the conversation?
Because it's the bread and butter of the entire economy. Like the economy does not exist without supply and demand, right? So supply, if I think about it, supply is what's getting put out and demand is what's getting what people want, right? Does what you're putting out match what people want? I mean, that's ultimately an easy way. So if you think about any sort of exchange, you think about relationships, you think about just business, like do your consumers want what you're putting out, and that's why people buy your stuff? Is this person interested in a relationship with you, which is why they see, they pursue a relationship with you? I mean, it's all about supply and demand, guys. Any give me any scenario in life, it's all about supply and demand. And so I think it is extremely important to understand, specifically for your business, like how that works, and really be able to break that down. So I know we had a couple of examples. We had a diagram. We can pull that up right now.
Yeah,
So
so I think one of the ways to kind of think about it is just, supply and demand tend to move in opposite direction. Or I guess you say they don't move in the opposite direction, but they oppose one another. Like,
yep.
the supply is, like I said, what you got to offer. The demand is, okay, how many people want it, or how much do they want it? And the way that these two things interact has a lot to do with whether the price goes up or down. So you were going
Hmm.
to say something about this when I pulled this up, and I apologize,
Yeah,
I cut you off.
you did cut me off. Put some respect on my name, but okay, it's fine. No, but more seriously, so in situations like this, like for those that may be listening on the podcast and can actually see the video, essentially, like Terrell said, supply and demand they're opposing, right? So, like I said, when you're putting too much out there and your supply is greater than the number of people that actually want it, your prices go down. And that just basically means that your product isn't worth as much as people as you think it is, right? So you're supplying it, you're putting it out in the market. People don't really want it. So prices go down because people really aren't willing to pay for the value of what you think your product is worth. So that would be supply and demand. If we compare this to, your business, for example, if you have a large amount of supply out there, right, and you don't have a lot of people demand, let's say you sell cookies, just as an example, right? You put out, cookies every day, and you're just seeing like people are not really buying them, or you're not really getting the influx of orders that you originally expected for this new cookie recipe. You're probably gonna result in reducing your prices because you want to get this product to move. And the reality is, you just don't have as much of an ask and a demand for that. So, in simplified terms, I hope I was able to explain it simply. That's what that means.
That cookie example made me think about something where there was this one shop or whatever that when I was growing up, where they made, they made food and they made it fresh every day. And
Mhm.
and I think people started getting on to the idea of, well, if you wait closer to closing time and you go buy your stuff, you're going to get it at a discount, because they have to throw it away or they're going to have to take it home. And so when you get closer to the end of the day, when your option is Do I throw it away, or do I just reduce my price and, let more people buy it? Because you see that, I think we see that a lot of times when it comes down to like food that gets cooked fresh. Like if you've ever,
Mhm.
and I have friends who do this, and I'm just like, I'm not a huge fan of that idea. But a lot of
Do
friends, some friends, and I'm not gonna lie, I did this when I was in college. I didn't have that much money.
confessions.
And
Okay.
so whenever I would go into the grocery store, you go to the section that has the meat, where you look at the expiration date, because the stuff that was just about to expire was going to be on sale.
Oh
Now
no.
I'm not eating old meat.
I mean, you use the worst possible example ever. Meat, like that is one thing I do not play with. I'm not even gonna lie. Not when it comes to something that has been alive. No, 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 no. Because you don't know what they put in that thing. But no, definitely. And you see it, right? So they give you discounts because they're trying to get it off the shelf because they put out more than people actually wanted or needed, I guess, in this case. So it's definitely, it has a, I guess, a cause and effect. So like supply is out, demand is lower than supply, and so your prices have to go down if you want to stay in business, or if you actually want to make money from whatever it is that you're selling, some sort of, some
Yeah.
sort of return. Hmm.
Yeah. Because in that case, the other option that they have is, if I don't sell this, I'm gonna have to throw it in the trash. So the idea is, hey, I may not get the top dollar price that I originally asked for,
Right.
but if I drop the price enough, then maybe I can sell the extra. And I think, it's amazing that there are some businesses that have built their entire business model off of that. Like, on the
Hmm.
topic of food, and I think about grocery stores, like Aldi's produce is based on that strategy, because, no offense to Aldi's, but when you buy some vegetables from Aldi's, you better be ready to eat it within 3 to 4 days.
I thought the reason why the Aldi vegetables went bad so quickly was because they were fresher. That was my understanding. I mean,
Oh,
Aldi's got me through college. Like if there was no Aldi's, there probably would have been no Lola. Okay, so I mean, I kind of take that a little bit personally because
no, I will
I
say I still shop at Aldi's. I still buy it.
yeah,
I
you
just
do.
know that whatever vegetables I buy from Aldi's, I better be ready to eat it within, the next 2 days. Because if I
Yeah.
wait longer than 2 days, then that vegetable isn't going to be as good. Whereas you go to other stores where it was more fresh, I would say the lifespan on it is a little bit longer, where I may pay a little bit more for the same spaghetti squash at the grocery store down the street. But that spaghetti squash can actually sit in my refrigerator an extra couple days.
That's because that spaghetti squash was grown in a lab somewhere. Okay, that's why. And Terrell is taking a water break. Welcome back.
But yeah,
All
so
right.
and I think that, like I said, there's a lot of businesses that have built their entire model around that. Even when you think about clothing,
Mm-hmm.
you think about TJ Maxx, Marshall, Burlington. What they have done is they looked at brands that had a lot of supply and that they couldn't sell it at their market rate price.
Mm-hmm.
Then they ended up selling it in, at a significant discount. Like, I've gone into like a Burlington before and seen a shirt that I'm like, man, I looked in the designer store at that same shirt, and it was like 5 times more expensive in the designer store. But I'm guessing they had too many, or no one bought it from the designer store. So they sold the excess to Burlington, and then Burlington drops the price and they're able to sell it, because the whole idea is you're trying to say, okay, all right, if no one is buying it at the top price and I have too many of them, how low
Mm-hmm.
do I have to drop the price before someone says, okay, now I'll buy it? And the goal
Right.
is to do that before you have to throw it away.
Right. Agreed. Agreed. And I think on that point of supply and demand, if we go to like the second point, right? If you have more, if what you're offering is less than people want to pay for, you have a situation where you do have an advantage to actually increase your prices, and prices do go up in this situation. So basically, supply is less than demand. I think I think this is a good example. When you have situations where people like Black Friday is a perfect example of this, right? But I honestly think it's almost fabricated, but that's a different story. So you have situations where you have people waiting in line for a limited amount of products, right? And so the supply is small, but then your demand is so large. And so people are able to either increase prices, for iPhones or whatever the product is, compared to if you had the reverse, which we just talked about.
Yeah. Well, I think Black Friday is an interesting one because I think in Black Friday touches kind of a
Mhm.
mix of these two, whereas at the original box office store, they've had so much supply, they're dropping the price because they're trying to increase the demand for it. And then what some smart hustlers and entrepreneurs have done is like, hey, let me get in line. Let me go buy these TVs for a low, low price. 2 weeks later, the people are still going to want these TVs. I'm going to raise the price 2 weeks later because, hey, the ones that Walmart had on sale are no longer on sale. So I bought mine early. And I think
Mm,
that working that spectrum of really controlling, hey, supply and demand. And I think another example of that, one that I grew up with and used to see happen a lot, was whenever a new pair of Jordans comes out. Now,
mhm.
the interesting thing about growing up is that whenever the Jordans came out, there were never enough pairs of Jordans in the store for all the customers that wanted to buy them.
Mm,
So people would get in line early, and the prices kind of reflected the fact that, hey, there's a limited number of shoes available for people to buy. So the prices were a little bit higher and they would still sell out because people wanted them. Now, people were willing to pay that higher price. Now, if you say, hey, 3 weeks later, or let's say a month later, when they added more pairs of Jordans to the store, it's just like, hey, they got more supply in the store. So the prices may not have been as high on day one once they get more supply out there. And I think when it comes down to your business, the real key that a lot of business owners are trying to really create is, how do you increase the demand for what it is that you do, whether that's
mhm.
your service, whether that's your product, is how do you get your demand higher than your supply. And then what you then start to do to control the dynamic of that is your prices start to go up. Like we did that in our service-based business where, in our accounting firm, when more people wanted to do business with us, we had to raise our prices because we're like, hey, we only have a limited amount of staff and we only have a limited number of hours in the day,
Right.
and more people want to do business with us. And people started saying like, hey, well, I know you only have a limited amount of space. Well, what if we paid you extra? Would you take us on? And I was like, well, yeah, sure. And that's where we started to see like, hey, the demand for what we do is greater than the supply, so our prices started to go up. So when you look at those two in connection, I mean, it really just comes down to that, is that when supply is greater than demand, the prices are down. When supply is smaller than demand, the prices tend to go up. Now, this is a
Mhm.
general rule. This doesn't mean that, hey, this is the way that it happens all the time. That's kind of just a general rule.
Right.
Now, one of the things that I think is very interesting, because I want to get to some of the examples, but before we start to dive really deep into the examples, what are some of the situations that you've seen at a larger scale? Like, what are some type of products that you've seen this supply, demand, and inflation impact?
Oh wow. I mean everything, I think. The one that comes immediately to my head is, I mean, the gas prices. I think that's a pretty big one. The baby formula shortage is another one. But I do think that I think that there's a lot there's a lot that probably are out there that I can't think of right now. Do you have any other examples?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that I've seen is just in the trucking industry in general.
Oh.
Like, we have some friends that, that have trucking companies. And one of the things that they were telling me is like, man, it's hard to find drivers. And
Mm-hmm.
when it became hard to find drivers know, hey, it's a ton of trucks out there, but it's only a
Right.
limited number of people willing to get in
Correct.
there and drive them, which means if you want me, you got to pay
You
me
got to
a
pay me
little bit
more.
more.
Yep.
And I
Yep.
think that
Agreed.
that's a dynamic that a lot of times I think business owners aren't really thinking about is, hey, how is supply and demand impacting how you run your business? Because unfortunately, a lot of businesses were really caught off guard when it came down to, hey, the supply of what they were doing drastically changed.
Yeah, the labor shortage is one I think that's definitely hit, especially here in the US. I don't know how it is in other countries. Actually, I think it when we were in France, we noticed it some, right? Where they were short staffed at the restaurants that we went to. But I mean, that's a completely different story for another day.
You know, I what, since you brought it up, let's let's
No, no,
let's talk
no,
about it.
no. We
Okay.
no, we are like
Now,
26 minutes into this episode, and we need to keep it moving. That's
no,
all.
it's
Like,
fine. No, we're gonna talk about it. I mean, we
oh
got at least 45 to minutes to cover. So we got time. We
oh
have plenty
god,
of time and we're gonna talk about it. All right. So for all the people, if you are French and you are listening to this, please send me a comment in, find me on LinkedIn. It's Terrell A. Turner, CPA. Send me a message. Because I really want to understand because while we were in France, one of the things, and part of it may be just the fact of me being so American. Now, I've
very.
lived in other countries before, and I've traveled to other countries, but it was very, very interesting that it was almost like I understand that there's a work shortage, but it was almost like people were just bothered that I came in to do business in their store. And I'm just like, okay, am I bothering you that I came in to buy something? Like, I feel like, you know, there should at least be some kind of like mutual respect for this. Like, I'm here to shop in your store to where I just could not wrap my mind around that. Like, okay, maybe they already have a ton of people who come in here and buy, and I'm just, some little small customer. But I'm like, I'm the only one in the store. Like, you're running low on the supply of customers. So what's the
Yeah.
deal here?
I think I valid point. I'm not sticking up for the French in this case, but I will say based on the experiences that we had, I mean, I think it was twofold. I think one of it was like they're not commission based. They're not getting paid on, tips. Like for example, if you take the restaurants, right? They get paid whatever they get paid regardless. So it's not like your tips are gonna help move their life forward or whatever. Like they're getting paid the same. The second thing I think also is just the stereotype behind the typical American tourist and coming in there and wanting to take it in the eyes of the French just based because I remember vividly the encounter that we had at that restaurant, which I will not name, and the gentleman clearly telling the Canadian Frenchman, oh, you Americans, you come here and you try to take over and you're very rude and blah 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 blah, whatever he said. And I mean the dude was like Canadian French. He's like, I'm not even American, but it's just I think that there is it's just cultural differences, I that's one thing I've noticed. Like even when we were traveling, just the expectations in America, just of the service, the quality of service, the pace of service. Like we noticed it even here with the labor shortages. Like they were literally having to explain to people why their food is taking 20 and 30 minutes instead of 15, or why they can't sit you outside, or why you want this seat instead of the other seat. It's just like, hey, we don't have enough service to serve your table. That is why. So why is the wait so long? Like, I'm not coming back here anymore. Like, all of those things I think are just indication of, the fact that there is a labor shortage one. But I think just going back to the France thing, it's just a difference in culture. That is my view. So
Okay.
let
Now,
us not
I would
offend
say,
our French audience, please.
I'm not trying to be offensive. I just kind of want to understand, the incentive dynamic, because
Right.
maybe I was doing something culturally wrong that maybe I should have, you know, maybe I should have like stood a certain way or walked in at a certain
You didn't
pace or
even speak,
whatever.
but you didn't even speak French. That's the problem. So you just come in there, parlez-vous. You don't even parlez-vous. You just come in there. You speak English. Like you just assume this person speaks English. It's just like so American of you to come to another country and just assume, in a country where the main language is French, that they will speak some sort of English to cater to your needs and your desires.
You
I
know
mean,
what? I would give you that probably was the case the first time. The second time I went to France, I was trying in my best attempt to speak French, but my
it
best
was more like
attempt
Spanglish, Spain
was
Portuguese,
probably
Portuguese and
not
Spanish.
all that great. But all that to say, I mean, getting back to the point, I do think another example that probably more and more people are becoming familiar with is when it comes down to the housing market,
Mhm,
because here in Charlotte, North Carolina, where we live, we saw dramatic jumps in the value of homes, and to
mhm,
where some people, friends of ours, were saying like, hey, they were trying to, buy a new home because of, with COVID being at home more, they wanted more space. And they were saying, man, some people were bidding like 50,000, 100,000 over the asking price, to
mhm.
where it was, in a sense, it was a limited supply because people wanted to be in certain areas. They wanted
Right.
houses of certain size, which meant the demand was higher than the supply. And to bring it back to the economics and inflation, is when more money was being pumped into the economy through lower interest rates and these different rebate programs and stuff like that, when more demand was high and people had more money at their disposal, which meant
Mhm,
prices were going to go up, and prices continued to go up. Now, unfortunately for some people, the prices went up higher than their income could contain. So
right.
some people started feeling the effects of the inflation faster than others,
Yep. Yep.
because for some people, I mean, because not everybody makes the same amount of money. So some
Mhm,
people started feeling that, hey, and the prices have risen way higher than my income is going up, which meant that, hey, if you were in a, let's say, if your income was at a level to where it wasn't growing as fast, but your next door neighbor, their income was still growing fast, like you were experiencing the effects of inflation way before they were. But I think when it came down to the housing market, we saw a lot of that, to where the prices just shot up so fast that I think now people are starting to relook at it, especially
mhm.
because the interest rates are going up.
Exactly.
Interest rates are going up, and the effects. And the question that becomes is just like, when prices and inflation take effect and when prices rise so much, it's like, what do you do as a business owner? It's like, now
Mhm.
prices are up. Like, how do you navigate this? Like, what have been some of the things that you tend to think about?
In terms of navigating situations like this, is that your
Yes.
question? Yeah. So I think the biggest thing would just be finding alternative solutions, is alternative sources, right? I think one of the things that, like, if we go back to the housing example, one of the things that people felt like was, man, we were getting constantly outbid, right? Just in terms of the pricing, because A, I couldn't afford it, or B, hey, I wasn't able to put, $70,000 or $100,000 over asking price, whatever that is. So I think as a business owner, the first thing would be, I would say, is, hey, first of all, understand your supply chain. I think that's the biggest and the most important thing, right? Understand, how does the supply chain for your business work? Like, who are your, where are you getting your products from? How does it flow through? Because I think once you have an understanding of how your supply chain works, then it makes it really easy for you to understand, like, be able to take decisions from then to say, okay, these are the things that are happening in the economy. This is how it impacts me, and this is what I need to do differently to adapt. So the first thing I would say is understand what your supply chain looks like for your business.
Yeah. And, bringing up that point, I think it was a great one, because we talked about, what gasoline prices being what they are. I mean,
Hmm.
and let's say, take the perspective, like we know some friends that, have businesses within that industry. So, speaking of knowing your supply chain, if we look at the gas supply chain, so if you're in the business of providing gasoline, the supply chain typically starts off in the beginning with, the drilling, where they got to get the oil out of the ground or the oil out of the shales, wherever they're getting the oil from. Then there is a transportation impact there, to where
Hmm.
whatever they pull out of the ground, they have to transport it to the refineries if the drilling is not already at a location where the refinery is already at.
Hmm.
After it gets refined, then it has to be transported. Sometimes it's by pipes, sometimes it's by trucks, but it's transported to the fueling stations or to the gas stations, and then the end users or the customers show up in their vehicles to pump the gas, and all of this happens. So if you're a business owner, it's really taking a step back and saying, okay, all right, what does my supply chain look like? Now, what
Hmm.
part of my supply chain is causing the prices to grow faster? And then, is there something that I can do about it? So, what were your thoughts when we started thinking through like the gas supply chain?
I would say I think the first thing was understanding like what's causing the problem, right? Because I think there's just so much data and so much information in the news, but you really need to understand what the source of the problem is, like you said, right? Number one, understand your supply chain. After you understand your supply chain, like in the case of gas prices, for example, the reason why gas prices went up is because there was a cutoff in, I guess, sanctions that were issued to Russia. Russia is I think, the second largest producer of oil in the world. So when the sanctions happened, I think Russia sells, I think exports, the second largest export from Russia is to Europe. So when that cutoff happened, like through the sanctions, what happened was now Europe doesn't really have anywhere else to go buy oil because they're not buying from Russia anymore. So they went to, Saudi Arabia, and they're trying to buy from Saudi Arabia. But the problem is you also have the United States buying from Saudi Arabia, right? And other countries around the world. So now you have the classic situation where you have a supply and demand issue, right? So Saudi Arabia can't increase their production of how much oil they're producing fast enough to meet now the new demand, because that Russia thing, I mean, some people would say that, happened almost overnight, right? So in a matter of weeks, and it takes years a lot of times to set up any sort of refinery and production. So for me, I think it was first to understand what was driving the issue. And then once you understand that, like, as a for example, as a gas station, then you can really say, okay, what do I need to do differently here? Do I have any options in terms of, the products and the services that I'm offering to make sure that I'm understanding this, but also adjusting my strategy accordingly?
There's an interesting point that you brought up that I want to go back to, where you talked about, when it comes down to, gasoline, fuel. I mean, if we look at the supply chain, where before Russia invaded Ukraine and before
Hmm.
sanctions happened, supply was at a certain level because
Hmm.
Russia was supplying some, and then some of the other refineries around the world were pumping. But immediately when the sanctions came in, and you now pretty much everybody just are pretty much saying, all right, we're not buying from the second biggest producer of oil. Well,
Right.
India and China are still buying from them. And India and China are actually buying from them at a cheaper price. I
Yeah,
mean,
supply and demand, man. Supply and demand. Listen, because like, who's
I
gonna buy
mean,
all that oil?
yeah, I guess it works out in China's perspective because China looks at it and says, "Hey, Russia,
You need the
nobody
money.
else is buying your stuff. It's only us in
Exactly.
India. You need to cut us a
Exactly.
deal."
Yeah, you need the money. Like, who else is going? What you gonna do with this oil? Like, who else is gonna do it? Like, I don't know if this is an American saying, but like in Nigeria, it's like beggars cannot be choosers. Like, I mean, at this point, you gotta take what you gotta take. So, that's a really good point, actually. That's a
Yeah.
very good supply and demand example there.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those interesting things that, another aspect that impacts, supply is not so much just what's happening with, supply now. When you look at the supply chain, one of the things that businesses can learn from the what we're observing from the gas industry is that, okay, you say, okay, all right, people aren't buying it from Russia. Well, there are other places that refine, that drill and refine the oil. Why can't they just produce more? And this is where I think, when you start to take a deeper look as a savvy business owner, you start to have to ask yourself more challenging questions. And one of the questions that is coming up in the oil industry is, well, we have to weigh the risk. If more people
Mhm.
are trying to move to clean energy, do
Mhm.
I go and invest hundreds of millions of dollars to build new refineries that
Right.
may be obsolete in the next 10 years? And you
Right.
start asking yourself, like, is it
Mhm.
worth it for me to increase my supply? I mean, I think back to an example of, for people that may not understand it from the fuel, the oil, the gas perspective is, back when Henry Ford first made the automobile, let's say the person who was making, the whips for the horses and the
Mhm.
buggies, like, when the automobile was about to release, hey, the
Mhm.
automobiles are going to be released in the next 2 months. So people are going to start buying automobiles. It's like, do you go increase your inventory of whips? Because you're like, well, hold on. If everybody's going to start buying automobiles, why would I take the risk and go spend more money on something that people are going to want less in the future? And I think as a business owner, one of the great things that business owners, I think, have to do when they draw out their supply chain, it's, hey, is there anything happening in my industry that will cause people to want what I produce less as time goes on?
I
And
think that's, sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that's a really good point. And I think in that question, though, you have to ask yourself another question is my target audience and my customer base, can my customer base actually, let's go back to the Henry Ford example, can my customer base actually afford a car? Right? Like, who's more likely to, I think you almost have to assess the situation and ask yourself of this change that's happening that could drastically change and impact the demand for my product, or, you know, change the way that, I guess, how much demand I have coming in. Is my target audience actually going to respond to that change that's coming? Right. So, like with the
Mhm.
example of Henry Ford, like the people that were buying whips are likely people that like cannot afford to buy cars, because not everybody at the time, I don't know what the price was when Henry Ford first came out with his first car, but not everyone could probably afford to pay for a car, right? So it's almost like asking yourself, as you're thinking about innovating or as you're thinking about expanding your supply, do you have enough, essentially, do you have enough demand? Are there going to be enough people that are going to still continue to want your product to warrant you investing this money to basically build more, you know, to do more whips, in this case, like build more refineries? And to your point, like with the shift away from, the shift towards clean energy, there's less of a likelihood, maybe in 15, 20 years, that this is going to be something that people want to invest in. And then you've spent, a billion, I don't know how much money it costs to build a refinery, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, investing and building in something that there's no more incentives. Like a lot of the incentives these days are around clean energy. So as a company, as a larger company, what's really the incentive for you? Because again, companies are in business to make money. What is the incentive for you to open a new refinery and basically make a long-term decision based on a temporary solution, right? It's just not, it's important to ask those questions.
Yeah. And I think that one, it becomes a very big one that, you know, even if you're not in a very, very big industry, I mean, even in smaller industries, like I was talking to, a friend that, used to the sell like cell phones. Like,
Mhm.
one of the things they would tell me is, you go through this cycle of, let's say when the new iPhone comes out. So
Mhm.
new iPhone comes out and people really, really like it. And so over time, like he's buying iPhones and he's reselling them or he's fixing them up. Well, if it's maybe a couple of months before the new model comes out and
Mhm.
he has, the old model, he's like, I'm not trying to buy more of the old model because once the new model comes out, people's interests are going to change. Like the
Right.
demand for the old model is going to go down. And so I
Right.
think a lot of businesses have to really look at it that way to say, hey, are there some changes that are happening in the greater scheme of things that are going to cause the demand for my product to change? Because if the demand for your product is going to go down because of this greater change, then the question you need to ask yourself is, hey, how are we managing our supply? Because we don't want to be stuck just like that original restaurant we gave the example of. Is you don't want to get to the end of the night and have a ton of food that you have to throw away. Now you got to offer it at dirt cheap prices because it's either throw it in the trash and throw your money away or sell it at a really, really big discount because you didn't see the wave of demand changing for your product that you offer.
That's good. And I wanted to give another example that's maybe a bit more closer to people because we have restaurant owner clients as well. So like for example, with restaurants, this is an issue we saw at the beginning of the year. The labor shortage issue was such a big thing, right? Because and it was driven by changes that were happening in the economy. So for example, the stimulus payments that were coming out, right? If people are getting stimulus payments, why do I need to go to work if I'm getting paid the same or in some cases more than what I would make at work? Like there's no incentive there. And then secondly, the minimum wage increases were also another factor, right? So if I'm getting paid the same amount of money to do a restaurant job versus I don't know, doing something else, I have the option to choose as a worker. And so I think in those scenarios, like for example, in the restaurant industry, and just I think in most retail companies as well, asking yourself is how do I adjust, my business model and my supply chain to address some of these disruptions that may then impact how I'm able to serve my customers. So one of the things that we saw was there were a lot of companies that were shifting towards, doing delivery services, more of delivery services. There were a lot of companies that were shifting, or a lot of restaurants that were shifting towards doing more selected hours where you only open 3 times a week or 2 times a week, or, situations where they were giving incentives like companies that could afford it, giving like McDonald's, paying people like $1,000 bonus to come and work. Like, so all of these things are really the result of you understanding your supply chain enough as things are happening and as rules are getting passed to know, okay, how do I adapt quickly to where it doesn't disrupt and impact how I'm actually making money in my business? And even if it's going to, how do I bounce back from it quickly enough to where it doesn't have a significant hit on my business? I think the one that you gave was a good example where we have friends that are in the trucking industry, right? So people don't want to work. If I'm getting paid, if Amazon is offering me, I don't know what the pay rate is, but if Amazon is offering me more money than you would offer me as a trucking company owner, what's the incentive? Like, why would you need to pay me either more, or you need to pay me, to give me some sort of incentive to work for you, right? So all of those factors are extremely important that you consider, and you won't be able to do that until you really have a good view of how your supply chain process works. And then you can really understand, so you're not being reactive, but you're really being like proactive, right? So like you're thinking about what could possibly happen when you see things, and then you're like, okay, how do I adjust and how do I change my direction to make sure that I'm ready for this as much as I can be.
And speaking of, your tip you shared, if a person is trying to figure out, okay, all right, I see this pretty map that you guys did for how the supply chain gas works, are there any tips you would give them about, how they could map out their own supply chain?
Yeah, so I would say the first thing is just think of like, I guess maybe let's use do you want to use like a restaurant as an example? What I would say is the first question is think of, I would call it a process flow, right? How does your process from the beginning of whatever products you sell to the very end of when it finally sits at your customer's table or it finally sits at a client's home, like walk that process from the beginning to end. You don't have to walk every single detail, but at least just start from the beginning. So the first question is, where does this come from? Right? Like, where is the origin point of origin? Like, for example, if you're a restaurant, the first thing that you start with is farming, right? Because like if you're selling food, hey, someone has to be making it. Even if you're a chocolate factory, cocoa is where you're starting. So it all goes back to farming. And then you kind of ask yourself, okay, once the product is prepared, where does it go next, right? And basically you just follow that process. So you talk about, hey, the transportation, how does it get to me? Okay, is there a process in the middle between, when it's delivered from the farmer to the person that's, processing it or basically making it so it's good enough for me? And then after that process, it gets basically refined and then it comes to me and then I turn around and sell it. So that's kind of how I would think about it, right? It's made, it's processed, right? And there's two parts of that processing. There's the processing where, hey, we do this to make it suitable enough, right? And then there's the processing of where we're actually packaging it and doing whatever we need to do. And then the next step would be it gets delivered to me. And then once it's delivered to me, I figure out how I'm going to put it out to my customer. Those are pretty much, I would say, the steps of the supply chain. That's how I would define it. And I think it's probably easy if you take those things to really just break it down and say, okay, how does this work for my business and for my industry?
Gotcha. And I will say, I mean, another way that I would recommend that I think, can be helpful is I tend to think of things in very simple terms. So I explain it the same way, like I have conversations with, one of my 16 nieces and nephews, and they
Oh,
ask
wow.
me questions, and we just kind of work backwards to where it's just like, hey, there's a piece of chicken on my plate. They said, okay, where did that come from? Well, it came from the fridge. Where was it before then? And you just kind of walk it step by step
Right.
until you get
That's
back
good.
to, well, hey, it's on my plate. It came from the fridge. It came from the grocery store. Well, where did they get it from? Well, it came off a
Mhm.
truck. Where did they get it from? It came from a factory. And then we ended up back at a chicken. And it's just like, oh, okay. And I think that that's a good way for people to kind of understand,
That's good.
whatever product you have, just, okay, all right, before it came here, where did that
Where
come
did it
from?
come from?
And
Yep,
then
that's good.
take it all the way back. And then the thing that you can then start to do is, hey, is there some change that's happening that's going to impact any step in this process? If there is a change that is going to happen, then maybe ask yourself, hey, is there something I need to do to prepare myself? And
Mhm.
I'll conclude with this. And this is the part where I said that, you know, you try your best not to make this conversation very political. But I do think that one of the that you can't talk about economics, inflation, and recession, and you can't talk about those topics for business owners without also mentioning one of the things that you have to be able to do as a business owner is listen to the political positions that are shared, or whenever there is a policy that is being presented, is if you understand your supply chain and then you ask yourself, hey, how is that change going to impact my supply chain? And you ask yourself, not so much of just saying so you can argue with other people, just so you
Mhm.
know, like, hey, if that law goes into effect, what do I need to be prepared to do with my business so
Right.
that we don't get extremely hurt? Like, how do we navigate this if that does become a law? So, as you start to hear things in politics or as you hear things on the news, is starting to ask yourself, how does what I just heard, how is that going to impact my supply chain? And what do I need to do to make sure that I protect my business before any damage is done?
That's good. That's a good outro. No, but that was
So,
really good. I especially liked it kind of reminded me of the where do babies come from question. It definitely made a lot of sense. Like you started, the plate, the chicken on the plate, and trace it all the way back. That is a fantastic example. This is why you are so good at simplifying things. And that's why our clients pay you thousands of dollars to do that. Good job, Mr. Turner. Good job. All right.
well, I want to say thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of the CFO Game Plan, where this one we talked about the economy, we talked about inflation, talked about recession, not necessarily from, hey, how we feel about it, but more so of, hey, how do you think about the impact that it may have in your business and what you can do about it? So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you for tuning into another clip of the CFO Game Plan. To see more, follow us on YouTube and anywhere you listen to podcasts, because the CFO Game Plan is the place where accounting and finance meet business strategy.